Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Goff, and I am an implementation specialist with Michigan's MTSS Technical Assistance Center. And I have the great privilege of introducing our speaker for this afternoon's live session. Dr. Claude Goldenberg is the Nomalini and Olivier Professor of Education Emeritus at Stanford University. He received his Bachelor of Arts in History from Princeton University and an MA and PhD from the Graduate School of Education at the University of California, Los Angeles. He has taught junior high school in San Antonio, Texas, and first grade in a bilingual elementary school in Los Angeles. A native of Argentina, his areas of research centered on promoting academic achievement among language minority students, particularly those from Spanish-speaking backgrounds. Dr. Goldenberg received the 1993 Albert J. Harris Award from the International Reading Association, now the International Literacy Association, for an article describing improvements in early Spanish reading achievement at an elementary school where he taught first grade. His 2004 book, Successful School Change, Creating Settings to Improve Teaching and Learning, was the basis for the 2010 Best Research Award from Learning Forward. Dr. Goldenberg is also co-author of Promoting Academic Achievement Among English Learners, A Guide to the Research, and co-editor of Language and Literacy Development in Bilingual Settings. Dr. Goldenberg was on the National Research Council's Committee for the Prevention of Early Reading Difficulties in Young Children, and on the National Literacy Panel, which synthesized research on literacy development among language minority children and youth. He continues writing, volunteering, and consulting on literacy research and policy on promoting literacy development among students not yet proficient in English. Dr. Goldenberg, thank you for joining us today. It's a privilege to have you speaking with us today. The stage is yours.
Well, thanks, Dave. Thanks very much. And thanks to everyone who's attending. I'm delighted to be here. I was in Michigan, actually, really on the ground last week, maybe it was the week before, at your MTSS conference. And I'm delighted to join you again, even though it's virtually. So I want to thank Dave. I want to thank Michigan Digital for helping provide the tech support that we are relying on, and the whole MTSS crew. So let's get started here. I just want to let you know that I'm going to leave some time at the end, excuse me, for questions and answers. But if you have something you want to pop in the chat, particularly if there's something that's unclear, that would be useful to clarify, then put it in there, and Dave will make the call whether to ask me or not. It's not a problem whatsoever. So I want to start off with a phrase that I picked up, well, it's been, gosh, almost 3 years now. Well, no, a year and a half. Phonics instruction is not enough for English learners. And I want the listener, the audience, to think about whether this statement is true, or is it very true, or is it exceedingly true? Is it obviously true, or is it all of these? And what I'd like you to do is, in the chat, put your answer. Now, I'm an easy grader, so no one get nervous. This is a safe space, no blame, no shame. Just put in the chat which of these you think is true. Oh, I forgot. There's another option. Did I put all of these down? Yeah, all of these is an option. All right, everybody had a chance to weigh in the chat. So here's the correct answer. And the correct answer is all of these. All of these are true. So you can choose whichever one and you get full credit for them. Phonics instruction is clearly not enough for English learners, but it's still foundational. And oh, by the way, phonics instruction isn't enough for anybody. So there's me, Claude Goldenberg. I have 2 email addresses. If you want to follow up, ask for PDFs of some of the articles I'm going to cite, please feel free to do so. Happy to hear from you. So let me get to the learner objectives. This is great. One of the reasons I love this conference was that we were supposed to stipulate learner objectives. And I noticed in the program when I was there a couple of weeks ago that only one of my objectives was down. So I hate to break it to you, but I actually got 3 learner objectives. I hope no one objects. The first one is that participants will explore at least one new online resource and identify at least one tool or idea that they'll consider trying in their school or classroom. The second one is you will explain why phonics instruction, or sometimes called foundational skills more generally, why phonics instruction is as important for English learners learning to read in English as it is for students who are already proficient in English. And then third, I want you to be able to cite one study and explain how it supports the need to provide English learners with English language support as they acquire their phonics/foundational skills. So let me start with some useful resources because I want this to be as useful as possible right out of the gate. This one is called, very helpfully, Multi-Tiered Systems of Support for English Learners. Now, I hope you all, oh, Dave, do you know if people had an opportunity to download the PowerPoint?
Great question, Claude. They are in the Dropbox folder, and we just put into chat the link to the Dropbox folder, as well as Melissa put in a link to the Google Drive version of it.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So if you're interested, I've included in the what Dave put in the Dropbox, or the chat actually. I've included the live link. So I'm hoping that after I go through these very briefly, you'll go to one of them and kind of look around and kind of get a sense of what's going on there. So there's multi-system, multi-system of supports for English learners. There's a very nice webinar by Doris Baker at the University of Texas, 10 evidence-based practices supporting bilingual students' reading development. Now that's like an hour webinar, so it's unlikely that now during this webinar you'll be able to go to it, but that's something you want to have in your toolkit, because I'm sure you're going to want to go back and take a look at that. Excuse me. The other thing that's also by Doris Baker is a really good article on the diagnostic accuracy of Spanish and English screeners with Spanish and English criterion measures for bilingual students in grades 1 and 2. As you all know, one of the aspects of MTSS is that you want to do early screening to see whether students, before they've actually started having difficulties in reading, if there are some warning signs that they might be at risk for reading difficulties. And one of the issues in this field, as you probably know, is whether we have Spanish measures that are as useful as English measures for Spanish-speaking students. Now, we know that there are more languages than just Spanish. There's a group in California that's working on something called Multitudes, which they're hoping is going to be valid across languages and for students from different language backgrounds. That's not ready for prime time yet, but I'm hopeful in the next year or two it will be. But for right now, we have some very good evidence that there are screeners that are equally valid and reliable for both Spanish and English. So I would encourage you to take a look at that resource as well. And then we have one of the Institute for Education Sciences centers supported at the University of Houston, called the Center for Success of English Learners, and that has some resources. They actually focus more on older students, adolescents, so there might be some resources there. I haven't really checked lately. It's just getting organized, but there could be some resources there that you find useful. There's also this website, Colorín Colorado, website for educators of English learners, but also it has some good resources for parents in both Spanish and in English, some latest research in very sort of parent and teacher-friendly form. So I would strongly suggest that you take a look at that. And then finally, the Florida Center for Reading Research, sometimes fondly called UFLY, has an interdisciplinary reading research center at FSU, and that's the link. They have some very good resources as well. So we're going to move right to the first check. And the objective here is that participants will explore at least one new online resource and identify at least one tool or idea they will consider trying in their classrooms. So what I'd like you to do is, if you're with a partner or with someone, you may or may not be, or if you're alone, I want you to go to one of the resources in the previous slide, and I'll keep that up there, but I hope you've downloaded the PowerPoint, so you won't really need it. Go to one of the resources, identify a tool or idea that you might want to try in your school or classroom, and then be ready to name your selection in the chat. So I'm going to pause for about 5 or 6 minutes. This is just getting a little bit acquainted. Obviously, they're not deep dives, but I want you to get acquainted with at least one, maybe a couple of them that you then want to get more familiar with after this talk. So I'm going to put this up here. I'm going to set my timer for 5 minutes, and I'm going to be quiet, which is hard for me, but I'm working on my wait time. So go ahead and take a look at those and be ready to name your selection in the chat.
Dr. Goldenberg, we have a good question from Jennifer. Do these resources support preschoolers as well?
Yes, excellent question. Yes, they do. Primarily the one in Colorín Colorado, which is very broad spectrum, has a very wide scope. The one at University of Houston does not, because it's older readers. The diagnostic accuracy is going to begin actually with kids in kindergarten, when typically that's when these screening measures are used. And then multi-tiered system support, probably not, because that's such a good question that she asked, because one of the problems we have in this field, and not just English learners, but in general, is we tend to silo K-12 and early childhood education. And we all know that what happens in early childhood is extremely, extremely important in terms of language, in terms of what Jim Cummins calls literacy socialization. But a lot of times these two silos don't talk to each other. So I was extremely heartened when I went to the MTSS conference in Michigan, that on one of the slides, I actually took a picture of one of the slides in their comprehensive approach to improving literacy. The first item on the slide was taking a look at what happens in early childhood and building those early childhood experiences. So I really want to do a shout out to Michigan and the Michigan MTSS folks for bringing that into the picture, because they're just too fragmented and we need to have some consolidation. The reasons that early childhood is distinct from K-12, but at the same time, we need to think about literacy development as a continuum, literally from birth well into adulthood, and having these different spheres of influence kind of segmented doesn't contribute to that. So that's definitely something to put on our agenda to push on. So thank you so much for that question. Yeah, Dave, yeah, love the implementation rubric worksheet from the MTSS for EL's website. Yeah, that's one of the terrific resources there. Normally now I'd walk around and see what people are, looking over their, I'd look over their shoulders and be annoying. So you're lucky that I'm not there looking over your shoulder and annoying you.
Dr. Goldenberg, we're starting to get quite a few responses rolling into chat here, and I'm dropping them into your chat so that you can see.
Yeah, I see that. Thanks. Yep. The implementation rubric is getting a lot of play, isn't it? And then colorín colorado. Yeah. So we got about a minute or two left. So drop some of those in the chat just so other people can get a sense of what you're looking at, what seems to be useful, diagnostic accuracy of Spanish and English screeners, literature circles. Nice. Yeah, someone in Michigan last week, Coloring Colorado has a drop-down option for families. Great. One section is what if I don't know English? Right. Conference, parents often ask they can support. Okay, that's my timer. Time's up. Okay, great. Terrific. Share book reading for vocabulary. Awesome. Okay, good. So it seems like people are finding some useful resources there. I hope you'll have a chance to dig into them, and more importantly, I hope what you'll do is share some of these resources with your colleagues at your school or your district, and see if they can't provide some resources, some ideas, some suggestions for how to work with your English learners. Okay, terrific. Okay, so let's go on and kind of get into the excuse me, I'm sorry, into the kind of nitty gritty. And I want to, before starting my principal topic, I want to explore a couple of questions. The first one is, what is reading science? Sometimes called science of reading. And the next one is, what's the connection between reading science and English learners? Now, I'm wondering, if we were in person, I'd ask you to raise your hand, but we can't do that. I'm wondering how many of you have heard the claim or been in discussions where someone is arguing that science of reading or reading science doesn't really apply to students who are learning English. And I'm going to use interchangeably English learners, emergent bilinguals, multilingual learners. They're called different things. I was in Australia a couple of weeks ago. They call these students EALs, English as an additional language. But I've been hearing a lot, and I suspect many of you have as well, and many of you might even have your doubts or are skeptical about whether science of reading applies to English learners. And it's okay. Skepticism and doubt is fine. No shame, no blame. This is a safe space. But my hope, my plan is to try and address some of these issues, and that I hope we can explore further in the discussion, or certainly you can pop the questions in the chat. So that's kind of the larger, broader, you might say, kind of philosophical, but it also has some scientific dimensions to it. But that's kind of the broad framework here. So what I'd like you to do is to imagine two paths that begin as distinct. Now, if you're familiar with the simple view of reading, and if you're familiar with the reading rope, you'll know that this is going to be a similar sort of heuristic or model. But I like visual models, and I particularly like sort of traveling models, because I think of literacy as certainly a destination. I mean, you're trying to get to someplace, but it's also a journey. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, there's a developmental aspect to literacy that begins really at birth. Some people would say before birth, as mothers are reading and the child inside is hearing vibrations. But it's a long trajectory. It's a long journey to become literate. So I want you to think about two paths that begin as distinct, but then they have to converge to get to some destination. So now, what's the destination? Well, it's literacy. That's what we're aiming for. joyful, competent, comprehensive literacy, engaging teachers and students on a lifelong and really never-ending journey to become increasingly more literate, to use literacy functionally, but also use literacy for joy, for entertainment, for communication, for all sorts of purposes that literacy is designed to accomplish. So that's the destination there. And that is the house of literacy. That is what we're aiming for. So I'm going to move away a little bit from our fanciful metaphor and let's get a little more literal and ask the question, well, what are the pathways to literacy? So this is in essence what we know from the science of reading. Now, there are lots of details and lots of issues, but basically it comes down to this. We have one pathway is the communication or meaning focus. The other pathway is the foundational skills or the code focus. And if you're familiar with the simple view or Hollis Scarborough's reading rope, you can see how this maps onto it. This is basically it. So what are the components of these different pathways? Well, for the foundational skills or code focus, there's phonological awareness, there's letters and sounds, there's phonics and decoding. There's also encoding for writing and spelling. A lot of times we think about, the reading rope or the simple view of reading, but or the science of reading, but we should really talk about literacy. There should be the science of literacy and the literacy rope and the simple view of literacy, because encoding and decoding are opposite sides of the same coin. More importantly, they each reinforce each other. The more you know about reading, the more you know about writing. The more you know about writing, the more you know about reading. So we really should see them as complementary and mutually reinforcing processes. And then on the communication side, we have language, we have knowledge, we have experience, we have comprehension. And they're all brought together, these different components on the communication side and the foundational skill side, they're all brought together by fluency. Fluency integrates, brings together, makes converge not only the separate pathways, but the individual components within those pathways. Because eventually, to get to the house of literacy, they've got to converge, and they've got to converge in a way that is fluent, that is automatic, so that you can spend your time thinking about what you're reading, deploying your cognitive and metacognitive skills. And if you spend all your time trying to figure out what letter sounds are these and looking around for pictures to figure out what word you're stumbling on, then you're not going to be able to really get on the road to reading. You're not going to have that fluent convergence that will lead you to the house of literacy. So then the next question is, what are the practices that are necessary in order to travel the paths to literacy? Well, on the foundational skill side, you need to be able to, and taught to, manipulate the sounds and words. You need to engage in activities to learn the letters and their corresponding sounds. You need to learn explicitly the phonic rules, how the alphabetic system maps onto the sound system of the language. And you need to be able to apply those phonic rules to decoding words. And you need to have dictation practice, to practice hearing the sounds and writing the words, whether the dictation is spelling or the dictation is longer phrases. You need to have lots of activities and opportunities to practice encoding the oral language you hear into the written language that you can read. Then on the communication side, you need to have read alouds that includes language that it's a higher level and you can actually read, but you can benefit from orally. And you need to be able to engage in discussions and conversations to use that language, to discuss those concepts. You need to be exposed to and learn and be taught new vocabulary. You need lessons and activities to gain additional knowledge. You need to have experience with films and other media that'll expand your world knowledge and your specific and your background knowledge. And you need to be participating in field trips and real-world activities, again, to expand your base of knowledge, both specific to what you're reading, but also more generally to learn about the world and how it operates. So those are the practices that are needed in order to travel the paths to literacy. Now, I'd like you to think about this. Many students around the world learn to read and write in a language they are simultaneously learning to speak and understand. We call them English learners in the US. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, they're EALs in Australia. In Ontario, Canada, they're French as second language speakers. In Greece, they're Greek as second language speakers. There are lots of different words depending on where you are and what language they're learning, but they're all over the world. These students who are simultaneously learning to speak and understand a language that they're being taught to read and write. So learning to read and write a language you are learning is undoubtedly more complicated than learning to read and write in a language you already know. I don't think there should be any controversy about that. It's going to be more complicated for the learner and obviously for the teachers. So now I want you to think about this. If you're learning to read in a language you're simultaneously learning to speak and understand, is it basically similar to or different from learning to read in a language you already know? Is it basically similar to or different from learning to read in a language you already know? I want you to think about that and then be ready to answer in the chat the question that I'm going to put on the slide. Okay, so think about it. I'm going to give you about 15, 20 seconds to think about that. I don't like to spring questions on people that don't have time to think about it. Okay, so here's the question. And again, no blame, no shame, safe space. Which is true about learning to read in a language you are simultaneously learning to speak and understand? Is it basically the same as learning to read in a language you already know? Is it basically different from learning to read in a language you already know? Or no clue, you tell me? Okay, so I would like you to answer in the chat A, B, or C. Dave, I don't know how many people we have on the call, so give me a sense of when most people have had a chance to answer. Okay.
Yeah, we'll do. I'm kind of monitoring that right now.
Great. How many are on, by the way?
I don't know that.
Oh, okay. You think we've had enough time?
I think so. They're rolling in overwhelmingly B, couple of A and C responses, but yeah, vast majority are responding with B.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm going to go on, okay?
Yep.
Okay, so I know you're starting to hear the answer, and this is going to surprise the overwhelming majority. But the answer is A. It's basically the same as learning to read in a language you already know. But don't feel bad if you put no clue, you tell me. That's perfectly okay, and I will do that. I will tell you. So learning to read in the language you are learning to speak and understand is complicated. I think we can agree on that. And therefore, so is the teaching. But here's some good news. It's basically similar to learning to read in a language you already know. However, here's a qualifier. Similar is not the same as identical. So this is the basic argument that I'm going to make in the next half hour or so. That learning to read, whoops, I went too far. That this is the argument that learning to read in a language you're simultaneously learning to speak and understand is basically similar to learning to read in a language you already know, but similar is not identical. right? That's the basic argument. So let's talk a little bit about learning to read, just sort of in general. Learning to read essentially entails going from speech to print, and this is a phrase that was made, that was designed, that created, I think, the first person I ever heard say this or write this was Louisa Moats in her very influential book, From Speech to Print. And that's what learning to read essentially entails. Learning how oral speech is represented in written symbols. And this is the fundamental mistake that was made by theories such as whole language and other so-called natural approaches. The mistake was that they assumed that learning to read and write is analogous to learning to speak and understand oral language. That is fundamentally incorrect. Oral and written language are related, of course, but they're learned or acquired in very different ways. And the role of teaching is different in each one. Teaching is almost always required to learn a written language. You know, there are exceptions. There are kids who are known as hyperlexics, or kids who seem to intuit the alphabetic principle with virtually no guidance. There are exceptions. But by and large, for the large majority of students, whether they're children or adults, teaching, some amount of teaching is almost always required to learn written language. The same is not true for oral language. We are primed to understand, learn, and be able to produce oral language from the moment of birth. And that is not the case for written language. So we need to learn how oral speech is represented by written sounds. It's not analogous to learning to speak and understand an oral language. Oral language is part of human evolution. It appeared 300,000 years ago and is learned naturally. Written language is a human invention, a brief 5,000 years ago, and has to be taught almost always. So what needs to happen behind the eyes and between the ears in order to learn to read? Well, here's a picture of our brain. We all have one. And what we know from the brain research and some behavioral classroom research that I'll show you in a bit, that learners who know the language rely on a large network of brain regions as they try to bind orthography. And bind is a key term here. They have to bind orthography, which is the spelling system, to an already present knowledge of phonology, which is the sounds of the language, and semantics, which is the meaning carried by language. Now, these quotes come from a very important issue of the Journal of Neurolinguistics that I came across a couple of years ago when I was writing an article for the Reading Research Quarterly. It's in the reference list, and if you like your science of reading very sciencey, this is about as sciencey as you can get, because by using functional magnetic resonance imaging and other kind of imaging, scientists have been able to identify what parts of the brain light up when you're learning to read and when you're reading. And what they have found is that the process of learning to read essentially involves creating this reading circuit in the brain, where the orthography, the spelling system of the language, is bound to the phonology, the sound system, and then that's bound to the semantics, the meaning. That is what makes reading possible. And it's not a circuit that exists when we're born. It has to be created by having certain experiences, among them being taught to read. So this is what learners need to learn in order to read a language they already know. And this is what happens at the level of brains and neurons. So that, going back to our metaphor, traveling the code road in beginning and early literacy requires learning the alphabetic principle, which is that letters represent speech sounds, that spoken words comprise individual sounds. The sound symbol system, which we usually call phonics, is the most reliable way to read words, even in opaque orthographies. And if you're not familiar with this concept, opaque orthographies are orthographies like English, which are complex. There's a lot of irregularities. Now, English orthography, orthography just refers to the spelling system. English orthography is actually more regular than irregular. And even in irregular words, like through, T-H-R-O-U-G-H, the T-H and the R are perfectly regular. They're perfectly consistent. The O-U-G-H could be E-W or could be U. That's inconsistent. So that's a good example of an opaque orthography. But even in opaque orthographies, which are more regular than irregular, the sound symbol system, phonics, is the most reliable way to read words. And word recognition, therefore, by decoding, is what learners need to learn how to do, with then context and meaning secondary. So the idea is when you're teaching word recognition, remember that's the code road, word recognition. When you're teaching word recognition, you need to teach students to first try to recognize a word by decoding it using the sound symbol system, and then saying, okay, is that a word I recognize? Does it make sense here? That's the process of word recognition that has to travel the road code, but as you're probably anticipating, needs to make some references over to the meaning code. And we'll get to that in just a minute. But then all of these need to be working toward fluency. Remember the important role that's played by fluency. Fluency is not something you get to once individuals can read words and text and you practice, reading for readers' theater or whatever oral reading. Fluency needs to begin from the very beginning, because if you're not fluent recognizing letters and sounds, being able to segment words into individual components, using phonics and decoding skills, if you're not fluent from the very beginning, you're going to hit a bottleneck. So fluency is relevant at every step along the way. So these are the foundations for learning to read. Understanding the alphabetic principle, that spoken words comprise individual sounds, that the sound symbol system, aka phonics, is essential for word recognition, because you need to recognize words by using decoding and then referring to your context and word meanings secondarily, and all the time working toward fluency. Now, these foundations are necessary. They're essential for learning to read and write. And in most cases, and again, to varying degrees, but in most cases, they need to be taught. They're not naturally intuited or developed. These skills are essential for literacy to happen. However, they're not all that is involved. If all you have is a foundation, you haven't got much. Whether you're an English learner or fully proficient student in English, foundational skills there's a reason they're called foundational. But if all you have is a foundation, you haven't got much. I would not like to live in that building. For starters, there's no building there. There's a very solid foundation, but I like my buildings or where I'm going to live with, bathrooms and bedrooms and living rooms and, things above the foundation. So if all you have is a foundation, you haven't got much. But without a foundation, you've got trouble. Now, sometimes it makes a kind of cool tourist attraction, but more often than not, it's serious trouble, lethal trouble. You're putting kids at risk for a not very desirable outcome, not just in their schooling, but in life. So the foundations are really important. So I want you to think about the science of reading, which has become sort of a lightning rod. Forget about the science of reading term or reading science or SOR. Think about science of reading as the best knowledge we have about how individuals learn to read. And learning to read involves many components, right? There's one road that we talked about, knowing the sounds of the language and the letters that represent those sounds and using letters and sounds to read and spell words. Unfortunately, too often the science of reading is reduced to these foundational skills, just one road. And this comes about from various sources. Sometimes science of reading advocates emphasize foundational skills, and while they say the other is important, they seem to kind of perseverate on just the foundational skills. On the other hand, we have people who are skeptical about the science of reading, and a lot of times they mischaracterize the science of reading as being all about foundational skills. That is a very limited and inaccurate view of what the science of reading is, because they forget the other road, the understanding the words, having background knowledge, language proficiency for comprehension skills, all the stuff that needs to happen on the language and meaning and communication road. And it's all of these that encompass the science of reading. Both roads need to happen, need to be traversed, need to converge in order to get to the destination of the house of literacy. So, question is, what about English learners? Kids who are learning to read a language or simultaneously learning to speak and understand. Well, everything we know from the science of reading applies to English learners, but it's more complicated. Now, before getting to that, I just want to say a very brief word or two about bilingual education, which, as you know, is the single most controversial topic in this area. And bilingual education is desirable for many reasons. I'm a big fan. I think everyone should have bilingual education because I value bilingualism and biliteracy. We can get into that if anyone's interested. But the fact is that vast majority of ELs don't have the benefit of bilingual education. And the reality on the ground is most of these students have to become literate in the language they're simultaneously learning to speak and understand. So that's who my comments are directed to, these students and their teachers. But please, no one leave this presentation thinking that I'm advocating English-only instruction. Okay, so back to ELs learning to read in English. Now, it turns out, okay, and here's the part that I want you to pay close attention to, and I'm going to try to convince you. Learning to read in the language you are learning is basically the same as learning to read in a language you already know. Why do I say this? I say this because I learned from the Journal of Neurolinguistics that they both involve similar networks of brain activation. In other words, what English learners need to do to learn to read in English is basically the same thing as English speaking students need to do in order to learn to read in English. Now, this is a worldwide literature with lots of first and second languages. The studies cited and reported in the Journal of Neurolinguistics come from different parts of the world with different languages. There are students all over the world learning to read and developing as readers in languages they are simultaneously learning, as I told you several minutes ago. And guess what? Researchers have been studying them. So when you hear from skeptics of science of reading, particularly English learner advocates who are skeptics of the science of reading, say that the science of reading is based only on English-speaking students or only monolingual students, tell them they're wrong. Tell them politely, because you don't want to get into a fist fight or an argument, but tell them they are wrong. And refer them to the Journal of Neurolinguistics, which is in the bibliography. And you can refer them to other studies that I'll be citing in a few minutes. So the issue is that learning to read in the language you are simultaneously learning involves similar networks of brain activation. And then the question is, similar networks of brain activation to do what exactly? Well, to link print and speech. The same regions are involved in phonological awareness, that words comprise distinct sounds, the letter-sound mapping system, grapheme phoneme associations, letters and sound associations, and that learning phonics and decoding, using these associations to read words, and linking to the meaning system, the semantics, and all, again, this is all from the Journal of Neurolinguistics. The same things that English speakers need to do, English learners need to do. So the foundations are identical, regardless of whether you're learning to read in a language you know or one you are learning. That letters represent speech sounds, that letters and sounds combine to represent comprehensible words and familiar sounds of the language, to how those words and sounds are represented in writing. Aha, you might say, letters and sound combine to represent comprehensible words and familiar sounds. This is where the similarities end, and what we have where the differences exist, because what is comprehensible and familiar to English learners is precisely where the differences exist. Because remember from this slide, from this diagram, that learners who know the language rely on a large network of brain regions as they try to bind orthography to an already present knowledge of phonology and semantics. That already present knowledge of phonology and semantics is precisely the issue that learners of the language they're learning to read in. That's where the issues exist. So that what we have here is learning to read in the language you know and the one you're learning are similar but not exactly the same, because emergent bilinguals require additional supports that English proficient students typically don't need. And this is precisely what's reported in the Journal of Neurolinguistics. Language learners require additional supporting brain regions during learning because they have no or limited already present knowledge of phonology and semantics. Okay, now I'm running a little short on time. The second check would be to explain why phonics instruction is as important for ELs learning to read in English as it is for students who are already proficient in English. If we had more time and we were together, but I just want you to think about this. Instead of jotting down, then sharing with a partner why phonics and skills instruction is as important for ELs as it is for English learners, I'm going to just stop here and just try to let it sink in. And I'm going to leave this slide on just for a couple of seconds and think about that. Why is phonics and foundational skills instruction as important for ELs as it is for English speakers? And then this one. The basic answer is that they need to do the same thing. They need to make the same sort of connections to build that brain circuitry. Same foundational skills, but they need additional support. And now I want to turn to the part that is not just brain. I mean, brain science is great because it's so sciencey, you know, and it makes us think like, oh, it's really something here. But personally, I'm not convinced by brain science because until you can demonstrate it with actual kids in actual classrooms, that's what I find convincing. But I just want you to notice and just keep in mind this remarkable convergence that exists between what scientists have discovered looking in our brains, but also what actual teachers and researchers of students have found using classroom intervention studies, because they support identical conclusions of the brain research, that the foundations for learning to read is the same whether you're learning to read in a language you are learning or one you already know, but they're not identical because language learners require additional supports. So let me turn now to a fairly quick summary of two studies with English learners in kindergarten, first grade who are having trouble getting traction in learning to read. These are basically tier 2 supports. Some aspects of this can definitely be introduced in the classroom and be tier 1, but these were tier 2 supports. And this effective small group intervention with ELs began with an effective intervention for English monolingual struggling readers, right? Because the foundations are the same. So they began with a program that was demonstrated to be effective for monolingual kids. And the small group instruction, which had elements that should not surprise anyone. The goal was fluent, meaningful reading. They use a direct instruction approach. The elements were phonemic awareness, letter knowledge, word recognition, text fluency, comprehension, completely standard operating procedures. And they had activities, writing letters, sounding out, reading and rereading decodable text was a very important part of it, using comprehension strategies. But then for the ELs, they added language supports. Remember how the brain science told us that they need support in additional brain regions? Well, this is how this intervention provided additional support. For the language, they clarified the words and the content with visuals, gestures, and expressions. This is often known as sheltered instruction. They defined the words in the directions so that kids knew what the instructions were for the activities they were supposed to engage in. They highlighted 2 or 3 key vocabulary words. They provided instruction in English language use with student responses. This is not just comprehensible input in English, if you know that phrase from Stephen Krashen, but also comprehensible output. And the teachers used guided student story retelling and discussion. The idea was to provide instruction in English language development so the students would understand, comprehend the words and the text that they were being taught to read. The support for additional brain regions was being provided. And this study by Sharon Vaughn and her colleagues was the only one that was reviewed by an Institute of Education Studies panel that demonstrated a statistically significant effect in reading. Other studies demonstrated effect on phonemic awareness and letter sound knowledge, maybe some decoding, but they actually found effects on actual measures of reading. Then there was a later study by Linnea Airy that also added language support and also got moderate and strong effects on reading. So again, the idea was they took an intervention that was demonstrated to be effective for kids who already knew English, and they made additional supporting language elements, components, think supporting brain regions. They supported those brain regions, the language development of the students, by providing additional instruction in the language. And I normally don't like to put so many words at one time on the screen, but this is a direct quote from Linnea Airy's study, which really clarifies what they were trying to do, and it makes such an important point. She says, one purpose of the instruction, of the intervention, was to develop oral language by encouraging students to talk about the books and by explaining the meanings of new vocabulary words. These words were written in students' personal books, and the meanings were reviewed each time the book was read. Okay, now pay close attention here. Students were encouraged to decode unknown words by relying on their letter sound knowledge, foundational skills. They're encouraged to use their foundational skills to decode the unknown words. And then, watch here, and then cross-checking with meaning and pictures, excuse me, meaning and pictures to confirm the identities of the words. So you can see the relationship between using your foundational skills to be the first line of attack, so to speak. We talk about, word attack skills. I hate the militaristic metaphor, but okay, that's what it is. The first line of attack is to use your foundational skills to decode the words by relying on your letter sound knowledge. But then you want to think about, okay, is that a word I recognize? Does it make sense here? And you can use meaning and pictures to confirm the identities of the words, but you don't want to have students use meaning and pictures as the first pass at reading the word. And that's the mistake that these three cueing systems make. It's too random. They tell students to look at the pictures, look at the context, look at the first letter of the word. There's nothing systematic about these three cueing systems. It's random and doesn't teach a useful template, a reliable template for understanding and being able to recognize words. But you can see the relationship between the foundational skills and then providing English learners with the knowledge of the words in the text so they can do this cross-checking. In most cases, English proficient students don't need that additional language support because the words that are used to teach them to read are already familiar to them, by and large. There are exceptions, of course. But the words that are taught like run and see and dog and cat, those are words already in the vocabulary of English-speaking students. You can't make the same assumption for English learners. Okay, we're going to skip over this, but you can do it on your own because you have the PowerPoint to download. You should be able to state how or why one of the two studies that I reviewed support the need to provide English learners with English language support as they acquire phonics and foundational skills. And if you can't do this, then it's my failure, my bad. I really messed this up. So you can check me out afterwards and see if you can actually do this. So let me just turn to the bottom line for beginning and early reading for English learners. First, teach the big five explicitly: phonemic awareness, letter sounds, decoding, fluency, and comprehension. I mean, they are as important for English learners as they are for English speakers. Make sure the content and instructions are comprehensible. And I have here this phrase, strategic use of L1 is okay, What do I mean by that? Strategic use of L1 is using cognates, using brief definition, using brief explanations. It's not bilingual education. It's not instruction to provide skills and knowledge in Spanish reading or Khmer reading, Hmong or Japanese reading. It's the use of the first language to kind of bootstrap understanding and comprehension in the target language, which in this case is English. And a lot of times people think that English only instruction means, you banish the home language. Well, it's not true. You want to use it strategically as a source of knowledge to help the students understand, but you're not actually teaching in that language. But then you want to provide English language development instruction and opportunities that directly supports the reading instruction. In addition to general ELD, not limited to words and text, English learners are learning to read. This is very important, directly supporting the reading instruction. The students need to know the meanings of the words in the text they're being taught to read so they can do that checking, that cross-checking, to make sure they're reading a real word and that it makes sense in the context. But they also need additional, more general, more expansive ELD, which is not limited to words and text they're learning to read. If the only ELD they get is the ELD to support beginning reading instruction, it's not enough. It's an impoverished ELD curriculum. They need more expansive ELD so they can engage in conversations and discussions and lessons about science and social studies and math and things in and out of school that we need to provide them the tools with so that they can engage in. And all of this comes under the category of Tier 1. You need to provide this instruction in the classroom, is Tier 1. And the questions that arise is, what if students aren't getting it? What is the necessary support? What is sufficient support? Well, we don't have any guidelines for that. I'm hoping that in the frontiers of research, we'll push ahead on that. What I can tell you is that additional support in Tier 2 is required, and more intensive support for Tier 3 is required. It's got to be systematic, it's got to be explicit, and it's got to be cumulative. How much exactly, for how long? There's no algorithm here. There's no formula that will tell you, that will answer those questions. If you find that, please email me and let me know, because I've been looking around. I don't really think it exists. Okay, so finally, let me say a couple of things about what does not work for English learners and emergent bilinguals. First of all, as you might have guessed by now, a heavy diet of phonics and decoding with insufficient attention to the meanings of words and text, not good. 3Qing, using combination of letters, syntax, pictures, context clues to recognize words, sometimes called balanced literacy. It's actually unbalanced and random, not good. So then what does work? Well, instead of heavy diet of phonics with insufficient attention to meaning and words, as much foundational skills instruction as are needed to master the code with ample attention to word and text meaning. And instead of 3Qing, you want to have students learn the words using their decoding skills first. Learn to read the words. I skipped over reading. We want students to learn to read the words using their decoding skills first, and then confirming accuracy using meaning and context. So those are the first two. But in addition, you need other things. You need continued English language development and support to comprehend text. You need to provide content and background knowledge. All students need that. You need to build on student assets. Too often we overlook the fact that these students have assets in their home language, in their home environments. Sometimes this is called funds of knowledge. Students have assets. We think about what they don't have, English language proficiency. Well, we're working on that, but you also want to build on what they know, the assets they bring to the whole operation. And you want to provide relevant and motivating learning experiences. These are all the tools, all the strategies that we have to use within an MTSS framework in order to help English learners achieve at the highest possible levels of literacy development, both in school and in life. That's our charge. These are the tools that we have to use. These are the references that I mentioned. Some of these might be behind a paywall if you try to get them. Elsa Cardenas-Hagen's book, which I strongly recommend, is a book, so I can't email you a copy. But these others, if you're unable to get them, please email me. I'll be glad to send you a copy. And with that, I want to give you the obligatory multilingual thank you. And thank you very much for your attention. And see next for closing code. Glad I wrote a note. I would have forgotten. Here's your closing quote, closing code. You can quote it if you want.
Dr. Goldenberg, we do have a question in chat that I'd like to lift to you. And we still have a few minutes up until 2:30 if folks continue to have some questions here. But we have a question from a previous colleague of mine. Hi, Lynette. Lynette is wondering, is there a certain time recommended to begin explicit phonics instruction for a monolingual English learner? That is, wait until they have some oral language or begin immediately?
Okay, excellent question. The short answer is begin immediately. The longer answer is it depends on what you mean by explicit phonics instruction. You know, we talk about phonics in kind of an undifferentiated way. This is why I like to talk about foundational skills, because foundational skills includes phonics, but other things, such as phonemic awareness. And one of the best ways to begin foundational skills instruction is with rhymes and songs and poems that familiarize students with the sounds of the language and draw attention to things like rhymes, where you have similar endings, which once you recognize those things, you are starting phonemic awareness. So you want to begin familiarizing students with the sounds of the language by songs, rhymes, chants, and having students repeat them and learn them, which is perfectly adequate before kindergarten, right? It's something we do in preschool, or we should do in preschool. So if you have an expansive definition of foundational skills, then you can see how this will play right into what eventually become phonics instruction. Now, beyond phonemic awareness, you can begin phonics instruction once you have begin to build some familiarity with the language, and phonemic awareness instruction can begin to be a little more systematic. I've recently written a couple of page thing that I'd be happy to send to anyone who emails me, suggesting how to do phonemic awareness instruction with English learners, and trying to point out the fact that doing phonemic awareness instruction in a more explicit and structured way, rather than just poems and rhymes, which I advocate, but that's, relatively unstructured. Doing phonemic awareness instruction also contributes to English language development, because you are sensitizing students. You are teaching them the sounds of the language. And once they're learning the sounds of the language, you can start introducing letters of a word like cat, the CAT. Listen to the sounds, have a picture of a cat. You're contributing vocabulary items. You can do it with dog. You do it with cat and with mat. You gradually introduce the sounds of the language, phonemic segmentation, the fact that letters and sounds have some non-random association with each other. So you can begin, but it's got to be mindful of the fact that the students are simultaneously learning the language as they are learning to read the language. If you're aware of that and sensitive to that, and structure your instruction so that both are going together, then you absolutely can begin foundational skills instruction as soon as students show up at the doorstep. Did I lose you? Uh-oh.
No, you're still.
Oh, okay. Did that end? Dave, did I answer the question or the questioner? Please ask if there's a follow-up.
I'm just looking here back in the chat. I don't see any other additional questions. Lynette, if please indicate if you have additional follow-up questions based on Dr. Goldenberg's response there. I'm not seeing any additional questions at this point, Dr. Goldenberg.
Okay, Dave, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Okay, most people said B. to learning to read in a second language in the language you're learning is basically different. Can we take another poll?
Yeah, absolutely.
Let me back up there. And this is really, I don't know who's answering what, so I can't, no shame, no blame, but I'm just curious if, let me see if I can find the thing. Hold on. Whew. Man, that was a lot of slides, wasn't it? Okay, here we go. All right. So I'm going to take those off. Give another bite at the apple, ladies and gentlemen. People are still around. I don't. Maybe they've logged off.
Yeah, no, I think they're still around. I'm taking a look here. Just waiting for.
And ladies and gentlemen, feel free to put any comments that you want, like, well, nice try, but you didn't convince me, or whatever. I mean, I'm really interested now. People, I've actually never done the poll after my presentation, so I'm really just curious.
Yeah, nothing rolling in yet, Dr. Goldenberg. I'm keeping an eye on the chat. Oh, here we go. We're starting to get some rolling in. Lots of A responses so far. We do have a response here. Thank you so much. I teach in a school with an 89% EL population, 19 plus languages spoken in our district, and we used a balanced literacy approach. Hoping to change that.
Well, that's good. Thank you very much.
Yeah, lots of overwhelmingly A responses here.
Huh. Wow. And they're not just doing it to humor me, right? There's no upside to that.
We do have a D, similar.
Okay. If that person would like to elaborate, I would love to hear that.
Yeah, Alexandra, if you wouldn't mind elaborating on that, we would appreciate that. Yeah, I think Alexandra is working on a response here, Dr. Goldenberg, to the D, similar response. We do have a comment. This was a wonderful discussion. It is always helpful to learn new strategies to help our EL students.
Great.
Absolutely. Let's see. Alexandra replied, having quote unquote the same underlined. I took it too far into quote unquote exact.
I took it. Alexandra took it too far to exact.
Yeah, that's how I'm interpreting that. Yeah, having the same underlined. I took it too far into quote unquote exact.
Oh, okay. So does Alexandra think now they're basically the same? The underlying is a very fair term to use. Mm-hmm. It's the same underlying process.
Yeah, we'll see if we get another response there.
So just say, Alexandra, I mean, I assume Alexandra can hear me. If you'd like to email me and continue this conversation or want more, I mean, I'd be happy to engage in that. So don't think you have to, I don't mean to put anyone on the spot.
Yeah, thank you for that.
I mean, it's an important conversation to have, and I've been having it a lot, and I'm happy to have it with whoever. You know, Dave, I'll just say while we're waiting here that one of the things that I've been hearing a lot from my English learner advocate colleagues is that there is a quote bilingual brain, and you have to, if you're not teaching with the bilingual brain in mind, then you're doing a disservice to these children.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I literally don't know how true that is. I know that when it comes to oral language, there's what's called a bilingual signature. There's indication in the brain that there are, you know, two languages going on. The question is, what does that have to do with learning to read? So I've been over the past couple of months since I've heard this popping up, consulting. I've consulted with, I don't know, half a dozen or so neuroscience brain scientists, which I am not. And it's hard to piece I'm having trouble getting a straight answer, but the kind of answers I get is, well, I don't know, and I don't think anyone really knows. And the other answer I get is, I don't think so, probably not. It really, the brain is going to respond more to the language in which you're learning to read, you know, the orthographic features of the language that you're trying to read, more so than whether it's a first, second, third language. That's really not relevant. So what I'm concluding in my not quite scientific survey, and certainly not complete because I'm still working on it, is that's a red herring. You know, that's misleading to say that you can't teach kids who are learning to read as they're learning a second language in the same way because their bilingual brain requires, you know, something completely different. I don't think that's true. I'm not going to be definitive about it because I'm not yet satisfied. But I believe that's not really accurate, and I don't think it's really particularly helpful. But I'm going to be kind of provisional because, you know, I've not explored all there is to be explored. But I would just recommend to, if anyone's still listening, that they think about this and, you know, do their own, you know, Google searches and so forth. It's hard to sort through because people make all sorts of claims, and then it's hard to evaluate because I can't evaluate neuro-linguistic research. I can't read brain scans and tell you what they mean. I rely on scientists who actually know that and can interpret it. So I'm a little bit kind of at a loss. So I'm wondering why these EL advocates are so certain about this when it's very difficult to sort of parse through, but they're very certain that there's a bilingual brain, and if you don't teach the bilingual brain, you can't teach kids how to read. Their certainty kind of puzzles me, to tell you the truth.
Such an intriguing thing to ponder, right?
Yeah.
I wanted to thank you for that, Dr. Goldenberg. I did want to reach back out to Alexandra if you were still on and just remind you, Dr. Goldenberg is completely open to you and anyone else on our session today to reach out to him via email for further conversation. Dr. Goldenberg, it was an absolute gift to have you with us today.
Thanks, Dave.
We much appreciate your expertise and wonderful presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks to say my regards to all my new friends at MiMTSS and Michigan Digital. It's been great. Thank you. Thank you all very much. And to anyone who's still on.
Thank you.